everyone, welcome back to Pill Talk. Today we will discuss about the receptors in our body and how they keep us connected to the world around us. The receptors are specialized sensory nerve endings that detect and respond to various stimuli. These can be in the form of unmyelinated endings or specialized encapsulated structures. So when stimulated, receptors generate impulses that are transmitted through the afferent nerves to the brain or spinal cord. In simpler terms, receptors act as biological transducers. Just like an electronic transducer converts one form of energy to another, receptors convert different types of environmental stimuli into nerve impulses. So this process enables our body to interpret sensations like touch, pain, and even chemical changes. Now, receptors can be classified broadly into two categories. Number one is exteroceptors, which respond to external stimuli, and interoceptors, which handle internal stimuli. Now let's discuss exteroceptors. So exteroceptors can be further divided into three main types. Number one is cutaneous receptors. They are also known as mechanoreceptors, and they are located in the skin and they respond to mechanical stimuli such as touch, pressure, and vibration. For example, when you feel the texture of a fabric or the warmth of sunlight, so these receptors are at work. Number two are chemoreceptors. They detect chemical stimuli such as when you smell a flower or you taste a food. And number three are telereceptors. They respond to stimuli arising from a distance such as light and sound. So your eyes and ears are excellent examples of organs connected with telereceptors. Let's take a closer look at different types of cutaneous receptors, which are specialized structures located in the skin. Each type is responsible for detecting a specific kind of stimulus. First, we have the receptors responsible for touch. These are the Meissner corpuscle, and it is sensitive to light, touch, and changes in texture, and it makes it essential for detecting fine details. And the number two is the Merkel disc, which is another touch receptor. It plays a role in sensing sustained pressure and texture. Next are the receptors for pressure. The Pacinian corpuscle respond to deep pressure and vibrations. It helps us feel sensations like a firm handshake or a vibrating phone. And the temperature changes are detected by thermoreceptors, which includes cross and bulb, which sense cold, and the raffinate and organ, which is responsible for detecting warmth. And finally, we have receptors for pain, free nerve endings, also called nociceptors, which detect harmful stimuli such as cut or a burn. It signals the body to take protective action. Now let's break down the different types of exteroreceptors and their functions. Exteroceptors are divided into three main categories based on the type of stimulus they detect. Firstly, we have the cutaneous receptors, which are found in the skin. These are further divided into touch receptors, pressure receptors, temperature receptors, and finally pain receptors. So firstly, touch receptors like the Meissner corpuscle and Merkel disc, which help us detect light, touch, and texture. Pressure receptors such as the Pacinian corpuscle, which sense deep pressure and vibrations. And temperature receptors, which includes the cross and bulb for cold and the raffinate and organ for the warmth. Together, these are called thermoreceptors. And finally, pain receptors, which are known as free nerve ending nociceptors, which detect harmful stimuli. Next, we have chemoreceptors, which respond to chemical stimuli. These include taste buds, which detects flavors on the tongue, and olfactory receptors, which allow us to sense smell. And lastly, we have telereceptors, which detect stimuli from a distance. These include rods and cones in the retina, which are responsible for vision, and hair cell in the organ of corti, which detect sound for hearing. Let's have a discussion on interoceptors, which are receptors that respond to stimuli arising from within the body. So these are essential for monitoring internal conditions, and it ensures that body functions smoothly. Interoceptors are divided into two main types. Number one is visoreceptors and number two proprioceptors. Visoreceptors are the receptors which are located in the viscera or internal organs, and they monitor various internal conditions. For instance, visoreceptors play a role in detecting changes in blood pressure, organ stretching, and chemical composition within the body. And proprioceptors are the receptors which are crucial for sensing changes in the position of different parts of the body. They help maintain balance, posture, and coordination by providing constant feedback about the movement and position of muscles, joints, and tendons. Interoceptors are divided further into visoreceptors and proprioceptors. So let's talk about first at visoreceptors, which are found in the internal organs and help monitor the body's internal environment. These include stretch receptors that detect stretching in the heart, urinary tract, and other areas. And number 2 are baroreceptors, which senses changes in blood pressure within blood vessels. Number 3, chemoreceptors, which are responsible for detecting changes in chemical levels like oxygen or carbon dioxide in the gastrointestinal tract and the brain. And number 4 are osmoreceptors, which monitor osmotic pressure. It ensures fluid balance in the body. Next, we have proprioceptors, which are key to understanding the position and movement of different body parts. So these include muscle spindles, which senses changes in muscle length. And number 2 are the Golgi tendon organs, which detects tension in tendons. And number 3 are the Pacinian corpuscle and free nerve endings, which are found in ligaments, joints, and fascia that senses pressure and joint movement. Number 4 are hair cells in the vestibular apparatus, as you already know, which are essential for maintaining balance and detecting changes in head position. Let's discuss some of the key properties of receptors. Firstly, we have the specificity of response, also known as Muller's law. So this refers to the idea that each type of receptors respond exclusively to a specific type of sensation. For example, pain receptors respond only to pain. Temperature receptor detect changes in the heat or cold. So this specificity ensures that different sensations are processed accurately by the brain. The type of sensation perceived also depends on where the receptor's nerve fibers terminate in the brain. Now let's talk about adaptation, also called as sensory adaptation. This is the process by which a receptor reduces its response when it is continuously stimulated with constant intensity. Over the time, the receptor becomes less sensitive, a phenomena also known as desensitization. Receptors can be classified based on how quickly they adapt. Number 1 are phasic receptors. They adapt quickly. These include touch and pressure receptors, which respond rapidly to changes but stop firing if the stimulus continues. Number 2 are tonic receptors. They adapt very slowly. Examples include muscle spindles, pain receptors, and cold receptors, which continue to respond as long as the stimulus is present. Number 3 is the Weber-Fechner law, which describes how receptors respond to changes in stimulus intensity. So according to this law, to double the response of a receptor, the stimulus intensity must be increased by 100 times. This means that the intensity of sensation is directly proportional to the logarithmic increase in the stimulus. Here is the formula, which is R is equal to K log S, where R is the intensity of the response, K is constant, and S is the intensity of the stimulus. Next, we have sensory transduction, which is the process by which receptors convert environmental energy like light, sound, or chemicals into electrical signals called action potentials in nerve fibers. Think of it as a receptor acting like a translator, converting one form of energy into another. So when a receptor is stimulated, its type of receptors handle this process differently. For example, chemoreceptors convert chemical energy into action potentials, and touch receptors convert mechanical energy into action potentials. It enables us to perceive touch and pressure. One is the receptor potential. So a receptor potential is a non-propagated transmembrane potential difference that develops when a receptor is stimulated. So this means it occurs locally at the receptor site and doesn't travel along the nerve. It is also referred to as generator potential because it is short-lived, and it is also called as transient receptor potential. In the diagram, you can see how receptor potential is generated. So before stimulation, the membrane shows no change in potential. After stimulation, the potential develops at the receptor site. It creates a local circuit current. So this leads to the generation of an action potential in the sensory nerve fiber, which then transmit the signal to the central nervous system. Last, we have law of projection. So the law of projection states that when a sensory pathway from a receptor to the cerebral cortex is stimulated at any point along its path, the sensation caused by the stimulus is always perceived at the location of the receptor. So this happens regardless of where the stimulation actually occurs. So for example, even if the nerve pathway is stimulated artificially, the sensation will feel as though it is coming from the original receptor site. Let's look at some examples to understand this phenomena better. So if the somesthetic area in the right cerebral cortex, which is responsible for processing sensation from the left hand, if it is stimulated, the sensation will be felt in the left hand, not in the head, where the cortex is actually located. Another example is the sensation experienced by amputated patients. commonly known as phantom limb pain. So when a limb is amputated, the cut ends of the sensory nerve fibers may form scars. So if these scarred nerve endings are stimulated, the patient may feel as though the sensation or pain is coming from the missing limb. So this misinterpretation is due to the brain projecting the sensation back to the original site of the receptor, even though the limb is no longer existing. With this, thank you so much for watching to Pill Talk. Stay healthy and stay informed.